Happy Wednesday or hump day, whatever you call it, at 7:01 here on the East Coast. I'm Anne-Marie Green, and we begin this morning with the results of election night 2019. Democrats have declared major victories and some history was made. In Virginia, for example, Democrats flipped the House and Senate from Republican control. And in Kentucky, a razor-thin margin gives Democrat Andy Beshear a slight edge over incumbent Republican Matt Bevin for the governorship. Laura Podesta has been following the results and joins us now. That Kentucky race, it's probably still too close to call, right?
That's right.
Though someone's already called it for himself.
Exactly, the Democrat.
Right.
But the incumbent governor has not conceded. But if, in fact, it does flip blue, this could be a real bellwether for 2020, because if a notoriously red state like Kentucky can elect a Democrat as governor, that does not bode well for President Trump.
Thank you, Kentucky!
Democrat Andy Beshear declared an upset victory in Kentucky's gubernatorial race last night.
This election is over. After tonight, we move forward.
But current Republican Governor Matt Bevin has not conceded.
Would it be a Bevin race if it wasn't a squeaker?
Bevin is down by less than 1 percentage point in a state President Trump won by nearly 30. He can ask a court to approve a recount.
This is Kentucky. This is the way we roll.
The governor tried to tie himself to President Trump, who came to Lexington Monday night to help with the campaign.
And if you lose, they're going to say Trump suffered the greatest defeat in the history of the world. This was the greatest. You can't let that happen to me.
The Trump campaign said of the result, the president just about dragged Governor Matt Bevin across the finish line. Kentucky's other statewide races all went Republican, including Attorney General. Daniel Cameron became the first African-American in state history to win that office.
Now it's time to not only talk the talk, but to walk the walk.
In neighboring Virginia, Democrats rode a suburban wave of support to flip both the state House and the Senate.
Virginia is officially blue. Congratulations.
It's the first time in over 20 years that Democrats have control of the legislature and the governor's office.
So the other state that a lot of people were watching, Mississippi.
Correct. And Mississippi stayed Republican. We know that both Vice President Pence and President Trump recently went to stump for Lieutenant Governor Tate Reeves there. Now all eyes are on Louisiana. Voters head to the polls later this month, and they're hoping to elect a Republican governor to take out the Democrat there.
All right, we will see. Laura Podesta,
We shall see. Thanks.
Joining me now with more on the Kentucky elections is Bill Estep. He's a reporter at the Lexington Herald-Leader. I don't know if it was a late night for you or not, because I know some ballots are probably still being counted. Why did Kentucky become such a nationalized race? And I should say, let me rephrase that. I know that a lot of people were looking to Kentucky as kind of like a bellwether, but is that fair?
I don't know that it's entirely fair. I mean, to some extent, but this race, I think, was really about Matt Bevin. He's been such a he's made a lot of folks mad here in Kentucky. His teachers, members of his own party, he feuded with at times. So, in this race, the Republicans attempted to nationalize it. There was a lot of talk about abortion, gun rights, those sorts of things. But Beshear, the Democrat, who is the apparent winner, he stuck to local issues, education, jobs, those sorts of things. But I think when you really come down to it, I mean, if you look at the returns, out of 1.4 million votes cast, Beshear is ahead at this point about 4,600, less than about 0.3%, in fact, which is why Bevin is not conceding. But if you look at all the other, there were 5 other constitutional races on the ballot. Republicans won all those by pretty convincing margins. In some cases, the top vote getter among the Republicans got 150,000 more votes than Bevin. So you had a situation where a lot of Republicans went to the polls and voted for Republicans except for Bevin. And I really just think in some ways primarily this race was about him. As I said, he's angered teachers, he's angered a lot of folks, and it was something of a referendum on his style, I think.
So let's talk about Beshear then and what he did to appeal to at least a slim majority of the voters. I know that the teachers definitely had an impact here.
There's no question teachers, and he was endorsed by some unions. there were some folks who said that Beshear had one of the better ground games that they've seen in the last 20 years in Kentucky. So people were out there knocking on doors. They were doing that kind of work and turned out to vote. And as I said, he kept the focus, that there was an attempt to nationalize this race. He really kept the focus on what he called kitchen table issues, jobs, the economy, education, those sorts of things. And so far, it looks like it's worked out for him to do that.
Yeah, and as I understand it, you mentioned that he had like a really good sort of ground game, and he went out into what is kind of like at times called Trump country. He went out into sort of the smaller towns and spoke to people. And the impression that I got is he presented himself as a more moderate Democrat, and it worked for him.
He did. I mean, one of the key abortions in the race that hurts Democrats. Kentucky is in the main a relatively socially conservative state, so the issue of abortion motivates a lot of people. Beshear obviously was not in step with a lot of Kentucky on that, but on a lot of other issues he was. But again, you come back to with the economy in relatively good shape, a Republican incumbent in this state shouldn't have had that much trouble. So I think a lot of that comes back to Bevin and his style and how he's turned some people off.
So tell me about this. Because I was under the impression that with Bevin, I mean, not only did people who were likely to vote Democrat not like him, but Republicans didn't like him either. What were some of his problems?
Well, if you look back to the primary, a relatively unknown first-time state representative in the primary against Bevin got 40% of the vote. That was a real signal that he was going to have some problems this time. And so then you bring that forward to the general. There's some indication some of those Republicans who were turned off by him in the spring, or generally who voted against him in the spring, just set it out in the fall. They just didn't come out to vote. As I said, there were in some case there were 100,000 or more voters who voted Republican generally, but did not vote for Matt Bevin, and that was the difference in the race. So some of the things that he did, I mean, he was very harsh in terms of his. Because the state of Kentucky has some problems in its public pension system. Bevin has been trying to address that, and they've done some things. But one of his proposals that was going to sort of roll back benefits for teachers really angered the teachers. There were a lot of protests in the legislature when they were considering that. And as a result, Bevin was very harsh in his criticism of the teachers. He said that he compared them to thugs at one point. He said that when some of them came to Frankfurt to protest, to the state capitol to protest, and as a result, schools were shut down in a few counties as a result of that, he said that he guaranteed that somewhere in Kentucky a child was sexually molested because they were at home rather than at school where they should have been. So the rhetoric really it angered teachers, and it turned off a lot of people who are supporters of teachers. And one thing to remember, in a lot of counties in Kentucky, the local school system is the biggest employer by far in these rural, small counties. And I think that was another dynamic in the race that hurt Bevin.
So, Bill, people are always trying to sort of figure out, like, what does this mean when it comes to President Trump? And he came down there right before the election, and he tweeted, liberally backing up Bevin, Bevin, rather. And it sounds like Bevin had a Trumpy kind of style, but it didn't seem to work for him there. Does this say?
One of the
Go ahead.
I was going to say, one of the messages is that, I think if the election were held today, Trump would win this state by double digits easily. He won it by nearly 30 points last time. He still has a base of support here, but I think maybe part of the message is that being Trump only works for Trump. And that may be something that other Republicans need to think about.
Yeah. Well, speaking of Republicans, besides this race in the state, it was Republicans all the way down. In fact, we've got Daniel Cameron. He became the first African-American attorney general in the state. How did he get there, and what does this mean for Kentucky?
Cameron is a very bright young lawyer. He becomes the first African-American elected independently statewide. Now, Bevin's lieutenant governor who ran with him was an African-American, Janine Hampton. Of course, they had a falling out during the term, and he did not put her on the ticket for this time. So that hurt him a little bit too, I think, among some quarters. But I think what it mean, Cameron worked for Mitch McConnell, and Mitch McConnell was the difference in that race. Also, he had a tremendous amount of support from outside money, was able to spend pretty liberally. And the other piece of that was the Attorney General candidate, the Democrat running against him, was a guy named Greg Stumbo, who had been a state representative for more than 20 years. He'd been Attorney General, but he had some baggage and a record to run against. And I think all those things came together, you know, the McConnell factor and Stumbo's baggage and the outside money all helped Cameron to win.
All right. Bill Estep, thank you so much.
Thank you.